Today is Saturday, February 1st. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programs have taken a hit recently. In fact, just this week, President Trump said he believed diversity efforts at the Federal Aviation Administration had compromised safety as he spoke about the plane crash near Washington, D.C. earlier this week. Though at this point, investigators have not figured out exactly how the crash happened or whether anyone at the FAA was to blame. Either way, DEI has been a grievance of the president's even before the crash. He's called it discriminatory and wasteful. And he's not alone. A wave of corporations have dropped their programs altogether in the face of criticism. So what does the evidence actually show? Dr. Teri Kirby is a professor of social psychology at Purdue University, and much of her research focuses on strategies people use to navigate diversity and inclusion in organizations. Even before Trump's latest reference to DEI, we talked to Kirby about the cultural shift in attitudes surrounding these programs, what DEI programs typically do for workplaces, including what often makes them succeed or fail, and what you might expect moving forward. Welcome to the Newsworthy Special Edition Saturday, when we sit down with a different expert or celebrity every Saturday to talk about something in the news. Don't forget to tune in every Monday through Friday for our regular episodes, where we provide all the day's news in 10 minutes. I'm Erica Mandy. It's now time for today's Special Edition Saturday. Teri Kirby, thank you so much for joining us here on the Newsworthy.
Thank you so much for having me.
So can you first just briefly explain what diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are usually aiming for?
Yeah, it's a million different things. So it's where do you need to improve diversity? We see this a lot with things like gender. So there might be quite a few women in a workplace, but then when we look at leadership, they might not be very well represented. So it really does depend on the organization, which is why a lot of scholars on this topic would recommend you want to actually tailor your initiative to what your goals are. But the other thing is that your goal may not even always be diversity. So the term DEI, it stands for diversity, equality, or equity and inclusion. So your goal might even be something like, oh, we think people aren't feeling very included. They're not feeling like they belong in this workplace. And then that might actually be your main goal instead.
To that point, could DEI also be things like paid family leave, accessibility for people with disabilities, and or other things that people might not realize? What is under the DEI umbrella?
DEI was originally, a little bit more focused on things like race and gender. But yes, disability is something that is definitely covered under DEI. We have laws to provide accommodations for people. And so part of DEI is ensuring that we are providing those legal accommodations. But it is also things like paid family leave. It can be flexible workplace policies. It can also just be as small as putting a diversity statement on your website saying that you value diversity. There's just all kinds of things encompassed by DEI. And some people would say that that means that DEI has expanded to the point that it's sort of, what does DEI mean? And we've gone away from this important focus on discrimination in DEI. The potential positive side, depending on what you see, that is that it means that many people can benefit from it in some way.
But when we hear about DEI initiatives or programs, that really just means what the companies choose to put that label on?
Exactly. So when we, hear about things like banning DEI, it's not clear what that means because that's the company's choice, what they would sort of call DEI.
What's your response to some of the criticism that maybe people are put in positions they're not actually qualified for just to satisfy some DEI quota?
So a lot of times people think, for example, the term affirmative action means things like quotas. So you must hire a blank person because we need representation. But since the early 1970s, quotas have been illegal, and there's just not a lot of evidence that's what organizations are doing. Often what organizations will do, if there's anything kind of like that, is they'll say, hey, we want to increase our representation of this group that hasn't been well represented in our workplace by, say, 10% by blank year. But what you actually usually see is that organizations don't even meet the goals that they set in the first place. So that kind of suggests that they're not just placing people into those positions just for the sake of it. There's also not really a lot of good evidence that it hurts the quality of the workplace. And in fact, representation in a lot of workplaces hasn't really increased tons over time.
Some people have even questioned whether certain industries have sacrificed safety due to DEI initiatives, such as the medical industry with doctors and nurses, or, as we've seen recently, the aviation industry. So what does the evidence say about DEI's potential impact on actual quality, but also safety?
There just isn't evidence for the lowering of standards. I guess if we do a thought exercise and talk about something that isn't even happening in the US, which is quotas, there is evidence about that too. So in Europe, there are some countries that use quotas. And even when you look at that, you don't see long-term decreases in work performance. You do see increases in diversity, but it's not that organizations are reducing standards.
You have said that your research shows DEI programs have failed. What does that mean?
I wouldn't say that DEI programs have failed, but it is really complicated. So, for example, things like diversity trainings, those tend to not have as much evidence for their efficacy. In fact, sometimes diversity trainings can even backfire. There's evidence that, especially when diversity trainings are mandatory, that leads to sort of a negative reaction from people because they're being forced into the training. And so some studies that have been done sort of over time in companies have shown that organizations that have a diversity training, their representation, for example, of Black Americans has decreased over time rather than increased.
Any thoughts on how these types of initiatives should work to be the most effective, whether it's considered DEI or not? What, if anything, does the research show about what actually works?
Mentoring types of programs do tend to have some success. There's a couple reasons that people think they have success. One is just that you're just getting people mentoring, you're getting them access to people who can help them, perform well in their roles. But it's also that you're getting people already at the company on board with a diversity initiative. But when we're thinking about actual diversity, the things that tend to be most effective are having concrete goals related to diversity and having diversity officers.
And so how have organizations typically measured the success of their DEI initiatives?
That's a great question because sometimes organizations don't measure the success of the initiatives. There's a really wide range. So because the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission does collect information from organizations about diversity, that can be one way that they assess, well, what is diversity looking like in our company? If we're implementing something called a diversity initiative, then maybe our goal is to increase diversity in things like race or ethnicity. Right? So they might look at those numbers. I know that companies like Google, for example, they're not doing this anymore, but for several years, they were posting their actual diversity statistics on their website to have some accountability for, are our initiatives effective or not?
There's been more backlash recently over DEI initiatives, and we're now even seeing several major American corporations, McDonald's, Meta, Walmart, et cetera, scaling back or even getting rid of their DEI efforts. So can you explain what's happening here and what's driving this?
Diversity initiatives can feel sort of threatening to some people. So for example, if you're a white person, you're more likely to feel like diversity initiatives aren't really for you. You're excluded from that. You're concerned that you're not going to be treated fairly in that workplace. And so I think one thing that's happened over the years that sometimes workplaces are reacting to that. But the other thing that's happened more recently is the Supreme Court decision in 2023. That was about universities. It was saying, okay, universities can no longer use race in admissions, but organizations are becoming worried that that can be used to, create lawsuits against them as well. And we have seen that a little bit. I think what's happening is that organizations are concerned that attention will be drawn to them if they have diversity initiatives, even if the diversity initiatives don't necessarily mean they're using race to make a decision about who they're hiring.
We have seen at least some of the organizations that are pulling back on DEI saying that they'll continue to focus on inclusion in other ways. What do you think that could look like?
We have some data from my lab showing that actually there has already been a shift over time where even in looking at diversity statements from organizations, that there's increasing reference to things like belonging and inclusion compared to diversity. So I think that that's something that you often see is that as there's a cultural shift or a legal shift, that organizations essentially adapt to that. So they might have some similar types of initiatives, focus more on the belonging or inclusion aspect of it, or they might continue some initiatives, but maybe not market in the same way as they did before.
Still ahead, Professor Kirby tells us the potential effects of this cultural shift we're seeing now and what the data says about how DEI impacts companies. She also shares her predictions for diversity and inclusion efforts over the next 4 years, including what research will focus on going forward. That's all coming up. But first, a quick break for our sponsors. If you didn't already know, data brokers make a profit off your data. Your data is a commodity. Anyone on the web can buy your private details. This can lead to identity theft, phishing attempts, harassment, and unwanted spam calls. But now you can protect your privacy with Delete Me. I'm now signed up with Delete Me's subscription service, and just in the first report, Delete Me removed 84 listings with my personal information. So these complete strangers had things like my name, home address, social security number, you name it, and they were selling that information. Well, no more thanks to Delete Me. To put it simply, Delete Me does all the hard work of wiping your and your family's personal information from data broker websites. Delete Me then sends personalized privacy reports showing what info they found, where they found it, and what they removed. Look, as someone who does work publicly, I am extra aware of my online safety and security, but we're all impacted in the online world we live in today. So take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me, now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan by texting Newsworthy to 64,000. Text Newsworthy to 64000. That's Newsworthy to 64,000. Message and data rates may apply, so see terms for details. The Newsworthy is also brought to you by OneSkin. It's not too late to reset for 2025 and swap out any products weighing your skin down or the ones that are so complicated they end up just sitting in your drawer. Instead, grab a regimen specifically proven to transform your skin at the cellular level with just a couple of pumps of product each morning and night. OneSkin's products are powered by their proprietary peptide called OS1. Because OneSkin believes the purpose of skincare is not just to improve how you look, but to also optimize your skin's biology at the cellular level, so it's more resilient to the aging process. Plus, I love the feeling of both the OS1 topical eye and face supplements. They're lightweight yet hydrating, perfect for every day. Simple yet effective. Founded and led by an all-woman team of skin longevity scientists, OneSkin is redefining the aging process with their proprietary OS1 peptide, the first ingredient proven to help skin look, feel, and behave like its younger self. Get 15% off with the code Newsworthy at oneskin.co. That's 15% off at oneskin.co with the code Newsworthy. And after your purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them, so please support our show and tell them we sent you. Invest in the health and longevity of your skin with OneSkin. Your future self will thank you. Okay, now back to our conversation. From your background in research and experience, what are the potential effects of this shift, both good or bad?
The potential negative consequences, I think, are related to representation in the workplace. So if you are an organization that says, hey, I'd like to have a diverse workforce here, there are potentially going to be some consequences because there is evidence that certain types of diversity initiatives can attract, for example, people of color, women to particular workplaces. So we could see changes there. But also when we think about just generational differences, so younger generations do tend to be more supportive of DEI types of initiatives. So I think it raises real questions about organizations that are pulling back on diversity initiatives, if that's going to be a culture that's less appealing to younger generations.
Can you speak to why it's important to consider diversity?
For some people, just from an ideological perspective, you might just decide we want to have a more diverse representation. There is a lot of evidence that discrimination does still exist in U.S. society. So by keeping an eye on these things, you can try to avoid discriminating, ensure there's representation.
And what about potential benefits or impacts of DEI for the companies themselves? What does the evidence show?
That is a complicated question as well, because it seems like whether or not diversity has benefits in the workplace depends on a bunch of different things. So it can depend on things like how complex tasks are. So there's some promising research that indicates that having more women in the workplace can be more beneficial, but not just on its own, it's when it's more complex tasks that people are doing. The other important thing that comes up, which is, I guess, kind of the funny thing about pulling diversity initiatives, is that to capitalize on diversity, a lot of emerging research seems to suggest that there might need to be sort of a safe, comfortable climate for people in the first place in order to get those benefits of diversity.
As we can tell from this conversation, this is a nuanced, complicated subject, which is why I think when we hear somebody making it very extreme on one side or the other, it's always more complicated than that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it is always complicated because, again, I think some of these topics do get a little bit overly simplified. For example, if you're someone who is a proponent of DEI in the workplace, then of course you want an argument that says, hey, diversity is beneficial. And that's going to be easier and more straightforward than saying, well, it depends on this and that. But that's the reality of the world. It is sort of messy. So I think organizations have to decide, well, if they think this is important, they care about diversity in the workplace, then they have to make those commitments to have the initiatives in place that are helpful, but that's a value judgment those organizations have to make.
What do you think is next in terms of what's going to be researched, what's going to happen over the next 4 years? Any kind of predictions or things that you're watching for?
I'm expecting there to be a lot of research trying to sort of better understand why there is the pushback against DEI. DEI initiatives can feel threatening. So what I hope and expect to see that will build on that and understand, well, how do we make people feel more comfortable with DEI initiatives in a way that can kind of keep some of the benefits, but also feel comfortable for everybody? Because if we can't get people broadly on board with them, we'll just see these initiatives going away. But I think that there will be ways in which these remain in place, and the focus of them just might change a little bit.
Well, thank you so much to Teri Kirby for joining us and sharing her insights. You can find out more about her research with the Diversity, Identity, and Prejudice Lab at their website. We'll link to it in our episode notes today. And you can follow her on X at Teri A. Kirby. Thanks to everyone who listened today. We'll be back again on Monday to give you the news you may have missed over the weekend in just about 10 minutes. Until then, have a great weekend.